Welcome back to the Women's Basketball Summit, the online platform for players, coaches, and parents. I am super excited today to be talking with Betsy Butterick, as we are going to be talking about the coach's coach. She's a communication specialist. So I'm super excited. Betsy, welcome to the call.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you having me on.
So I'm looking forward to this mainly because you were an athlete, you were a basketball coach, and now you work with basketball teams. So I think you're kind of like a well-rounded person to have a conversation about basketball.
I love talking about basketball. So yes, I would agree with you on that.
So let's start for anyone that's listening that's not familiar with you. Let's give them your background. Let's start with you as an athlete.
Sure. So I started playing basketball when I was 9. My family was living in Pennsylvania at the time, and we moved out to California, specifically to the Bay Area, when I was 11. And I immediately fell in love with Stanford basketball. And I went to all the games, and that was where I wanted to go. And I went to camp as a camper. And I applied out of high school, didn't get admitted. And I thought, okay, if I can get admitted, then I can try out as a walk-on. And so I went to the local junior college. It was Foothill Community College. I played there for a year. And then I applied again. I got rejected a second time. I actually had both rejection letters taped above my bed as motivation to get better. And I got a really nice note from admissions saying, hey, Betsy, we realize you've applied twice now. Good luck with your third try if you choose to do so. And I had a decision to make. And at that point, I had some Division I offers on the table. So I decided to let go of Stanford and then played Division I the next year out on the East Coast. Had a great experience, but didn't have the kind of time that I wanted to invest in academics. And so at the end of that year, I transferred to Division III Claremont McKenna. And I spent the next 2 years there. So very non-traditional path as an athlete, but it taught me a ton, and it allowed me to have a variety of experiences. I think so often, and this is a little bit of a offshoot, Jen, but so often when we are players, we're told, Division I is the goal. And if you're not good enough to play Division I, don't even bother, or, kind of let go of that dream. And having finished my career in Division III, I was so surprised to see that the biggest difference wasn't in the competitiveness or the quality of the basketball, but our point guards were 5'1" instead of 5'8", and our post players were 6 foot 6'1" instead of 6'6", 6'7". But the quality of the basketball was phenomenal, and I think that helped me later when I was coaching, especially when I was recruiting. So I graduated from Claremont in 2006, and I'd been coaching basketball camp for Tara at Stanford since I graduated high school. She asked before my junior year if I wanted to be the women's basketball intern once I graduated college. So I went right from Claremont to Stanford. I spent a year at Stanford with Tara. It was there that I met Tara's youngest sister, Heidi. Heidi at the time was coaching in the Seattle Storm with Ann Donovan, late Ann Donovan, and so after I finished the season at Stanford, I got on with their staff. So Sue Bird, Lauren Jackson were on the team. I had a great time spending my year with them, and then stayed in Washington because the University of Washington took on a new staff. So I was with the Storm, then I was at the University of Washington for a year, and then Heidi got out of coaching the pros, back into college, became the head coach at Occidental College, Division III, asked me to come be her assistant. We were there together for 4 years and won 4 championships in 4 years. Then she took the head job at UC San Diego. I went with her, and I retired from basketball in 2015 to do what I do now.
So I'm curious about, how did you all of a sudden be like, oh, I'm kind of done with basketball, and you kind of wanted to venture out on your own and start your own business?
Yeah, I wish it was that simple. It was actually a painstaking process. I was at Occidental, I think my second year at Occidental. We were in the Bay Area for a tournament, and our athletic director had come with us to meet with some donors in the area. So we finished a game, and I got a voicemail on my phone. It was our AD, and she said, hey, Bets, if Heidi says it's okay, I want you to take the van, drive up to San Francisco. There's someone that I want you to meet. So it was very dramatic, rainy San Francisco night, and I pull up to this whiskey bar, and my AD's sitting there with this woman, and she says, Betsy, this is Sue. Sue coaches leaders. I think you have a lot to talk about. And that was the first time that I recognized that coaching was something outside of sports. And as soon as I knew that it was, that's what I knew I wanted to do. That was the way that I wanted to contribute, to work with people. And so I spent a year earning my integral coaching certification through school in San Francisco while I was coaching basketball. And Heidi was very supportive. It was fantastic to work with someone that had such an investment in my best interest, even if it wasn't always in hers. I did have to miss 2 games that season. And then I was coaching coaches for about 3 years while I was also coaching basketball. And I got to the point when we were at UC San Diego after year 3 where I realized that I wasn't giving all of myself to either. And in trying to do both, I wasn't doing either as well as I would like to. And I knew if I wanted to make the kind of impact that I thought I could make, it meant having to leave what I loved. And I loved coaching with Heidi. I never desired to be a head coach. I would have stayed Heidi's assistant for as long as she wanted to coach. I lived 2 blocks from Windansea Beach in La Jolla. I had a great team, great school. I loved everything about coaching basketball. So it was really difficult to leave, but I knew if I left, that would allow me the freedom to work with more coaches and potentially make a larger impact. So that's why I left. I knew nothing about starting a business. It was one of those things you should have studied up on before you left. And I've learned a lot along the way. So it's been a journey, but one that I'm very grateful for.
So you talked about you were working with coaches as you were still coaching with Heidi. So when you're working with these coaches, what are you doing with these coaches?
You know, it's a funny question, because people always ask, well, so what do you do as a coach? You know, you're coaching coaches. What does that mean? And it's a difficult one to answer, because it means whatever it means to the individual. So there's certain themes that come up when you're coaching people that people ask for coaching around or seek coaching around. But every coaching engagement, every coaching relationship is different, and it depends on the individual. So my training as an integral coach, and it's just a fancy word for meaning we don't leave anything out, I'm trained to look at things from a whole person perspective. So if you, Jen, you're a strength and conditioning coach and you want to work on some area of your life, I'm going to look at that area and we'll work on that, but in the context of you as a whole person. Ideally, you get to show up at work in the same way that you show up in other areas of your life and kind of bring your whole self to it. So I get, trying to think.
So they're coaches, I guess maybe if I ask this a different way. Are coaches seeking you out for like one particular reason? Obviously, once you start coaching them, it might go down a different path. But are coaches starting to seek you out for like is there like one thing they start to seek you out for?
I mean, lately it started to be communication, and I'll get one-off calls. Hey, Betsy, I've got to have a tough conversation with a senior who was a captain last year, not going to be a captain this year. Their parents are major donors. How do I have that conversation? So I love those kind of calls. Typically, I meet people on either end of the spectrum. So there's the coaches that either an athletic director will call me in or a coach will reach out and say, hey, things aren't going well for me. I really need to make some changes. I don't know how. Can you help me? On the other end, and this is sometimes the more interesting place to play, is it's not damage control. It's people that are looking to take that next step in their career, or they've done as much as they feel like they can do individually, and now they want someone to take them to the next level. And the misconception, and I always tell people, I'm not going to tell you how to coach. That's the one thing that I won't do. But if you want to become a better one, that I can help you with.
Good. So now, obviously, like preseason started for like soccer, all the fall sports, basketball preseason is starting. Is your phone kind of ringing off the hook during a certain time? Like when preseason is, in season, is there a more popular time?
Definitely preseason, and depending on how, I'll say how good one's assistants are or how ahead of the game a head coach is, I start getting calls in May, June, kind of the end of the year prepping for next year. People, depending on what they need. I remember last season, Tara called me in June and said, hey, we've got a bunch of new kids. We're taking a trip to Italy in the fall. Can you design a workshop around the book that we're reading for the summer? And last year, Stanford women's basketball read John Gordon's Soup. And so I designed a workshop called Championship Soup. And it worked with what they'd done based off of what Tara told me they would need for that season. So that's my favorite thing to do and I did it for Penn Women's Soccer 2 weeks ago. Their head coach called and said, hey, can you do something about gratitude? And we did a 45-minute webinar all about gratitude for her team. And we're doing another one next week on owning your role. So I love being responsive to whatever's needed now, but coaches typically call me when they know there's some adversity they're going to face, or they find themselves in a situation where they could just use some outside perspective that's not an immediate staff member or a fellow administrator or coach.
Nice. So these coaches, I'm loving that these coaches are reaching out and asking for help. I think that's wonderful that they realize like they need a team around them to be successful. Right. For all the coaches that are like going to listen to this and they're like, yeah, I'm kind of skeptical, like what she could do for me. Like, you just talk about like why coaches need to have an open mind when it comes to like communication or hiring someone like you.
Sure. Well, and I think as educators, we're responsible for being consistent learners, right? If we get to the point where we think we know it all, that's when we're in trouble. And so people say, well, why are you a communication specialist instead of a communication expert? And in part, it's because I know I'm never going to know everything there is to know about communication. But by being a practitioner and continually studying and trying to learn, and then taking what I've learned or what I've failed at, and then putting that out there for others to learn from, that's what I'm responsible for. So I would say if people think that, and honestly, Jen, it's one of those things that we don't think about. And I think that's part of why I have the job that I do, is that we spend roughly 83% of our day involved in some form of communication, but we only tend to be intentional about it when we have something important to say, or we know we're going to have a difficult conversation. And so my goal whenever I work with groups, whether it's doing a championship communication workshop or an individual, if I can help people become a little bit more intentional about their communication, that's the goal. Because if we're a little bit intentional about our communication, if we can make some small shift to improve the way that our message is received or shorten the connection between what it is that we need to teach and the way that our student athletes learn, that's effective. We don't have a lot of time as coaches, right? So how can we shorten the distance? How can we improve the learning curve to lead to greater success?
Do you find that most coaches that are seeking you out, are they being proactive or are they being reactive where there's a problem, there's adversity and like they need to deal with it right away?
Both, unfortunately. And I think especially a lot of times with women's teams, one thing that comes up a lot that I have coaches calling for is my team is competitive, but they have a hard time holding each other accountable. Or they think that having those difficult conversations means that it's going to affect the relationship or the friendship. And that's something that often comes up for teams. I think some of the best teams know that communication is central to connection, and connection is what forms that chemistry that leads to championship seasons. So they know if they can work on their communication as a team, so you've got a common vernacular and vocabulary and a language that's specific to that program, and they have the skills to have all the conversations that we should be having, that often we fear having. If they can do those with each other, then that's more free time that the coaches have to focus on the things that they need to do. So
just as you're talking, like questions keep popping in my head. So coaches reach out to you. Are they normally asking for you to work with like the entire team, coaches included, or just working with the coaches, or both?
Good question. And I always put it back on the coach. Depending on the subject matter, there are certain topics, and again, it depends on the coach, but I'll say you're welcome, from my perspective, to be in the room unless you think that your team would be better served if you weren't in the room. And then if the coach isn't in the room, I always say, I'll debrief with you later. And one of the things that I found most effective with teams is I do what's called a championship communication resource guide. And I give the opportunity, it's just a blank note card. So I'll give each player a blank note card. And I'll say, these are completely anonymous. And I want you to write down a communication issue that you're currently having. And then within a week, I respond via email to that individual with some tips or advice for resolution of that issue. Within 2 weeks, I scrub all the questions for identifying information, and I give it to the coach and to the staff and say, look, these are the communication issues that your players are currently having. And I'll change things around so it's really hard to determine what issue came from what player, because I do want them to be able to be honest, because that's where the real work is done. But once you're aware of what issues are on your team, and then now you have some resources for handling them when they come up now or in the future, that just makes everything a little bit easier.
Now, sounds like do you do live trainings? Like if someone's local to where you are, do you do live trainings or a lot of it is more kind of online, Zoom calls, webinars?
Honestly, most of the work that I do is either individual coaching calls, so I'm working with a coach, or I'm doing a workshop or a presentation to a team. So especially when you talk about the topic of communication, it's much better in person. It's obviously effective virtually, and I know for some coaches or some teams, it's just not an option. They don't have the resources to fly me in. But when I can be on site with a team and observe practice in addition to doing whatever work we're going to do, that's when I can take notes and give feedback in real time to coaches and to players about, how are we communicating? Are we being effective?
So as we talked about earlier, like coaches do have limited time and they're always focused on like kind of the skill work and the practice. Then they want, people talk about the mental part, people talk about like the physical strength and conditioning, and now we have communication. So this is a loaded question, but why, if like for the coaches listening, why is communication such a huge part of the equation to be a successful team?
Because we do it all the time. And you think about, so basketball, if I'm going to go backdoor, it's not because I've told the point guard she's overplaying me past the back door, right? There's that recognition between teammates that something needs to happen next, not just what's happening now. And you equate that to, if we're only watching the ball, we're missing the rest of what's happening on the court. If we're only focused on what's happening now with our communication, we're missing an opportunity to set ourselves up to be successful with what's next. So in the course of a game, you have very little time to get your message across clearly and succinctly in a way that's understood by everybody. So if we can practice that when it's not an immediate situation, if we can do that in practice, if we can make that part of our skill training, then you're going to be much more effective when it comes to competition time.
If you had your way, when would you like to work with a team? Like preseason, in-season, post? Like where do you find it's most successful, or you don't?
I always before is great, right? Because if we can start from the beginning, there's that kind of rule in basketball, either discipline early or discipline often. So if I can come in and work with a team or a program at the beginning of their season and we get everybody on the same page, from then on, it's just maintenance. So you can call preseason and I'll come in and we'll do a workshop with the team. And then a couple weeks later, we're ready to start our regular season. We've got a big tournament coming up. Then we're going to do some little drills, basically, to ensure that people's communication skills, because it is a skill. And I think, Jen, that's one thing that people, they think they're either a gifted communicator or they're not, or they don't have what it takes to be a great communicator. And that's such a misconception. Anybody can learn to communicate extremely well. It just takes practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we've been talking a lot about coaches. Do athletes seek you out to work with you so they could be better communicators to their team?
Wow, I would love if that happened more often. I think it's mostly done on, it's mostly the coaches reaching out. I'll do leadership groups with teams. So a coach will reach out and they say, hey, can I have, kind of my class leaders? So 2 freshmen, 2 sophomores, 2 juniors, 2 seniors. Can they meet with you for half an hour every other week to talk about the language of leadership? Absolutely. But that's usually how, it's rarely an individual student athlete saying, hey, I want to work on my communication. That would be fantastic. That would be.
We're going to start a new business for you, for everyone listening. So we get some middle schoolers or high schoolers, they can reach out. So for all the coaches listening to the summit, is there like, 2 or 3 pieces of advice you can give them like right now to maybe help them become better communicators to their team?
Sure, absolutely. Gosh, if we had all day, I'd give you a ton. But for right now, so one thing I talk a lot about coaches with, when I do my championship communication presentation, at the end, I'll always say, natural close when we've taught something is to ask, are there any questions? But what's the difference if instead I were to say, what questions do you have? What changed in that context? And what happens is you can make small shifts in your language to remove barriers to your athlete's success. So instead of saying, are there any questions? And there's nothing wrong with that. But if I say instead, what questions do you have? I'm assuming somebody has a question, and I'm actually creating a space that invites them to ask it. So I've removed the barrier that someone first has to admit there's something they didn't understand, and then have the courage to ask their question. So small shifts like that. Another example would be if, let's say your team just got out rebounded over the weekend. So Monday comes, you're going to do a rebounding drill to start practice. So let's say you and your staff looked at the stats and you realize that every time you get out rebounded, you lose. So you've got 2 choices when you talk to your team. You can say, we're going to work on rebounding today because every time we get out rebounded, we lose. Or you can say, with the same statistics in mind, every time we out rebound our opponents, we win. But how you phrase those to your team sets up 2 completely different environments. In the first one, if you say every time we get out rebounded, we lose, next time they're in a game, with every rebound that the other team gets, they're thinking, oh no, what's happening? Whereas if you say, every time we out-rebound our opponent, we win, now I've got 5 players crashing the boards knowing with each rebound that we get, we're 1 step closer to success.
That's some great advice.
Thank you.
No, that really is, like, I didn't even think of it that way until you just said it. So for athletes, the players listening, is there advice you'd give if they want to be better communicators with their teammates, or, they're having a problem with the coach and they want to approach the coach, like how to communicate that way?
Absolutely. The first piece of advice, don't do it through your parents. I think that's something that we see a lot this generation, and you are doing yourself a disservice, and this goes for anybody, student athletes or anybody of any age. You're doing yourself a disservice if you're asking somebody else to speak on your behalf or to have the important conversations for you. It's okay if you don't know how to do them well, but that's where you start. So I do a workshop called Confrontation for Connection, and the reality is that most of us fear confrontation, and I was one of those people. When I first started coaching, I would say to anybody that asked, I don't like confrontation. It just didn't feel good. What I realized over time is that it was simply unpracticed. And the first step for me was rephrasing that as, okay, how can I see confrontation in a different light? And so as a coach, it sounds soft, but I phrased it for myself as caring conversation. So I cared enough either about the student athlete that I was coaching or about our team and our goals to have what would otherwise be an uncomfortable or difficult conversation. But for me, that was the starting point. So changing your perspective around what it means to have those, And then there's absolutely ways that you can engage in dialogue that builds trust and builds relationship and brings you closer to someone. But oftentimes we haven't experienced that yet, or we've been thrown into confrontation and it's gone poorly, so we don't touch it again. So if you're looking to improve as a student athlete in your communication, there's so many great resources out there. One of the best books I ever read about communication, it might be a little high level depending on the age of the student athlete, but it's a book called Crucial Conversations. If you read Crucial Conversations, doesn't matter what age you are, if you're above, I'll say middle school, so even the coaches out there, fantastic book, especially for having those harder conversations and doing it well in a way that's respectful and builds a relationship.
I think that's important what you just said about, like, as a student athlete, make sure you're having the conversation with the coach, not the parent. I think that is just something the parent should be listening to right now too, is, these kids need to learn how to communicate, because this in life, there's going to be adversity. Like, as you get older, you're not going to call mommy to go have a conversation with your boss.
Yeah.
So the younger we can have these kids kind of learn to communicate, stand up for themselves, I think the better.
Yeah. And the other thing I'd say, Jen, is ask questions. So a lot of times I see people approach a conversation, especially one that's a little more difficult, and they're approaching it from their perspective. And this is something that I see that's left out of conversations often. And it's that question of, help me understand more about blank. So I might, as a coach, have a student athlete that is consistently late to practice. And, our team has run a couple lines because of it or what have you. This individual is consistently late. When I have a conversation with them, it's going to be really easy for me to be judgmental and to be critical and berating. Instead of asking, help me understand why it's continually difficult for you to be on time to practice. When we seek to understand, a lot of times that's when we get the information that can actually allow us to address the problem. But when we just come at somebody instead of trying to understand where they're coming from, huge difference there.
I like it. I'm going to have to use that with working with my kids this coming week, because I was always brought up, you need to be 15 minutes early. So I like that. So as we're wrapping up this call, is there anything else you want to add to players, coaches, parents that are listening?
Sure. Keep your mind open. Keep learning. Seek information. Listen. That's the biggest way that you can improve your communication, is listen. So much of what we do as coaching is, how do we say what needs to be said in a way that that student athlete understands it? So basketball, you've got 16 people on your team. Yes, you can, as a coach, say things one way. But I think that's something that I learned as an assistant is, okay, our head coach is going to say something, and then individual players have questions. Or if you're teaching, let's say you're teaching lessons, you're teaching someone how to shoot, you can use the acronym BEEF, balance, eyes, elbow, follow through. That might make sense to one person, but somebody else might learn differently. So how can you change your language to convey a message to them in a way that resonates with them? The more specific you can get, and the same applies for student athletes. If you want to be able to lead your team or be a better teammate, think about the platinum rule. So not treating others as you want to be treated, but treat others as they want to be treated. And then ask yourself, what does that look like in terms of communication? And then how can I do that?
Nice. I love it. You'll hear the interview when it goes live, but I was talking to Billy Chambers, the head coach at Iona, and they have I think she said they have 8 new players on the basketball team this year. And she said they were working with a professor at Iona on personalities and how to get different personalities to gel. And I'm like, never heard of a basketball team doing that. So I just thought that was really interesting. And then obviously talking to you about the communications and how to gel. I mean, I love it.
Yeah. Well, and that's understanding your teammates. It's like, okay, we're all on the same team and we're all basketball players. So we have that in common. If you've got introverts and extroverts on your team, and that's usually the easiest way that people of a younger age will understand, I'm an outgoing person or I'm more of a quiet person. So I can tell someone, hey, if you have an issue with somebody, be responsible to go to the source, right? Don't talk about it with your teammates. Don't talk about it with other people. The conversation you need to be having is with the individual that you're having the issue with. If you come directly to someone who's more introverted and say, hey, I want to talk to you about this, they're completely caught off guard. But if you sent them, let's say, a text message, say, hey, there's something that's important to me that I'd like to talk to you about. When would be a good time for us to chat? If you give them some kind of warning, or instead of what can feel like a confrontation, you give them an invitation, now you're in a better place to have a conversation with that individual. So understanding our styles, but then working to educate ourselves on how to best approach people with different styles.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great advice. If people want to find out more about you, what you're doing, working with you, where can they find you? Internet, social media, website, what do you got?
Sure, absolutely. So if you go to betsybutterick.com, all of my social media information is on there. If you go to YouTube and you search Betsy Butterick, I think there's 23 currently ACT videos. ACT stands for Active Communication Technique. They're videos that are about 2 minutes or less, and they're designed to give you something you can do today to impact the way that you communicate and connect with other people. So a lot of tips are in there. They're all free. Watch all of them, watch some of them. I love getting feedback from people. I'll get texts and they say, hey, can you make an act video about this? You can also find me on Twitter at Betsy Butterick. I love when people tweet questions at me and say, can you give me a little bit of advice for this? I want to be a resource. I mean, we're talking about women's basketball. This is my background. These are my people. So thank you in advance for those of you that are watching, but also please reach out. Let me be a resource for you. If I can help you improve your communication, if I can help your team, this is what I left the thing that I love doing in order to do. So thanks for
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, part of the reason for the Women's Basketball Summit, number one is, you know, to educate, but also to start a conversation and be able to, people can reach out to you and learn more. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Jen. Thanks so much.
All right. So hopefully you and I will meet in person soon one day. And again, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Take care.